And you can already see that the SDAJ Youth panel is going to start. You can see them all up there. So over the next 50 minutes, we will listen to Selma Kleinau. She's just entering from the SDAJ. She's going to be the moderator of this panel. Great to have you. And I was told that when you were at school, you worked in the representation of pupils in North Rhine-Westphalia, and you fought against the Federal Armed Forces at school. Yes, that was a fierce battle, and we haven't won, but we're going to continue this fight. That's great. She now works with Verdi, the youth department of Verdi, and she works on the transformation in the automotive industry, and is also part of the board of management of the SDAJ in Germany. And you will probably introduce the people you're talking to yourself. So, and I wish you good results for your panel discussion. Fingers crossed. So the SDAJ, by the way, is the Socialist German Workers' Youth Association. I can see we're ready to start. Let me use this opportunity to welcome all of you warmly. Warm welcome to the youth panel of the Rosa Luxemburg Conference 2024. We're here in Berlin. I'm Selma. I've already been introduced briefly, and I will lead you through today's panel. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce the guests on the panel. I have with us Aimo, Dogus, Jan, Freya, and Ari. Warm welcome.
And again, today we are focusing on peace. That is why we want to talk about the impact of militarization on youth and the peace movement in Germany and the protests against war and for peace. But to begin with, I would like to introduce our participants. Ari is sitting here since 2022. She has been a member of the SDS. She studies cultural studies and is a member of the SDS. And she is an activist in Frankfurt for a liberated academia that does not serve the capital. A very warm welcome to you. And besides Ari, there is Freya, who is a member of the SDJ. She studies social work and works in the Verdi Union, the youth group. And together with her group in Kassel, she's been active against the German armed forces recruiting in schools, and it works very hard in Palestine solidarity with Palestine movement. Welcome to you. And besides Freya, there's Jan. Jan trained at an automotive company and are now studying in the Metal Workers Union, the IG Metall. He's in a youth group, and as an active person who finds out a lot about dual use and conversion efforts. He's also very looking at the dual use and conversion to armaments within the Metal Workers Union, the IG Metall. Welcome to you. I'd also like to introduce Dogus, who is in the youth, DIDF Youth. He's a lawyer and has focused on war and racism in his work. He's also active in solidarity with Palestine in Hamburg. Welcome to you. And finally, I'd like to introduce Aimo, who's in high school and will be graduating hopefully next year. For 5 years, he's been active in various occupations, and he is pushing for more peace activism in schools. Welcome to you. And now I would like to kick off with the first section of our panel discussion and say that the coalition government, compared to previous coalitions, has massively increased defense spending. On the one hand, we're being told that there's no money there for social affairs and health affairs, healthcare systems, but billions are being put into armaments used to fund wars. And we've been told that it's being done to defend peace in Europe, but as a young trainee, as a worker, or as a schoolgoer at this conference like I am, I think we all know that the real reasons are pursuing capitalist interests who are there to ensure that German economic interests are pursued. And so profit is being put before the interests that the civil society has. So Jan, I'd like to start with you and ask you, as somebody who's active in an organization that is very involved in the defense sector. You're working with young people, you're looking at dual use. Have you found the attitude of your colleagues in recent months has changed? I mean, this discussion about arms conversion, and what role do you think that has had in the past, and where do you think this money should be spent? Well, first of all, yeah, it's working. I mean, if I were to start saying where that money should be spent, I don't think we'll be finished by the end of the day, because there's so much to say here. There's so many industries that you could use to spend the money on, but it's not being used at the moment because the capitalist system naturally continues to put money in armaments. Let me say that I'm speaking for myself as Jan Hagelstein. I'm not speaking for the IG Metall. I couldn't do that, of course. So it's just my own personal experience and what I experience where I'm working. And then I'd also like to say something about collective wage bargaining and say that I don't think that this issue affects our negotiating. I mean, I think we have many different members here. We have armaments companies, but we also have many non-armaments companies. And so what we're aiming to do is to improve the situation of workers generally, and we don't focus so much on defense conversion or arms conversion, moving from military to civilian markets. But I think one of the things that's missing here is the whole question of how young workers see things. Namely, I think what's missing is an awareness of another way of doing things. You know, the 100 billion that were approved 2 years ago by the German government for defense spending, many workers saw as job security measures. And many weren't too critical about it because this 100 billion was money that they saw as preserving their own jobs. And of course, people are very aware of job security. And at the end of the day, what's actually being produced in their companies wasn't maybe so important to them. And I think not much has changed in recent months, I would have to say, quite frankly. Okay, what about you, Ari? Would you say that there's social dismantling taking place in universities, and how are the peace movement positions changing there? Because there's a different discussion at the universities than there is in the Metalworkers Union, for example. Well, first of all, thank you, and thank you for having us here for this panel discussion, and I'm glad that we can address some of these issues. First of all, I think we have to look at what function the universities have in civic society, and I think it's clear that it's providing the ideological foundation for the aggressive defense against the U.S., because we saw what happened in 1968 with weapons for everyone. You know, there was a very progressive movement in the 60s that came out of the universities. And I think much of it has been crushed by the neoliberal universities. And this has to be stopped. Students have to being made more disciplined, are made dumber than they are. And that's what's happening. So, you know, if the roof collapses in the Marburg University, for example, everyone has to say, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. We don't have any money. You know, in 6 semesters, I'll be finished from the university, so I don't need to care. This is a huge problem. But we can't just accept this. And what's more important when it comes to peace work at universities, we have to become more combative. And we have to fight for the civilian and peace clauses, because like politicians, Strack-Zimmermann, that's her name, Ms. Strack-Waxman, anyway, the FDP lobbyists who are working with the armaments industry, certainly our Minister of Education, whatever his second part of her double-barreled name is, has discovered this civilian clause and has seen that the battle for this clause can change the approach of universities. And as I said, the academic community has been dumbed down by Bologna. And the last little bit of critical thinking that we have there is being sort of destroyed. You know, democracy research tends to serve to describe peace movements as anti-democratic, and the social dismantling is very closely linked to neoliberal views at universities, and the research that's done there can be seen in this context. And it is the Minister of Education that you've just referred to, as well as the Foreign Minister in Germany, Annalena Baerbock, since the escalation of war in Ukraine, have wanted to see more youth officers in schools. So that means that the increasing armament and the pre-recruiting of the armed forces in schools is also present. So what are we seeing behind this increasing militarization? Well, it's not just Dogus Birdal, but also the defense policy views of the German government is saying that Germany has to better defend itself, allegedly, against countries like China. I mean, of course, that's a myth. If you look at how NATO has expanded itself more and more with troops, with maneuvers onto the borders of Russia and China, it's very clear what's happening. At the same time, Ukrainian sources are confirming that at the Istanbul negotiations end of March 2022, Russia would have been prepared to withdraw its troops if Ukraine were neutral, but the Western powers intervened here because they want the killing in Ukraine to continue. There's an interest that they have there. The Western powers are interested in the killing to continue so that their competitor, Russia, with a view of China, is weakened because NATO is losing ground. They no longer have this international hegemony that they had, and they're trying to strengthen it militarily. German imperialism is part of this US-led NATO, and the rise of Germany is something that is seen as more promising within the context of US-led NATO, as well as in the EU, where German interests dominate and which is being increasingly militarized. And none of this has anything to do with defense. In the white paper of the German Armed Forces, the Bundeswehr, we can read what it's about. It's about economic interests of Germany. It's about free access to resources, to trade markets. And that's the reason we're militarizing Germany. That's the reason why this fairy tale of the underfinanced German Armed Forces, the Bundeswehr, are used to increase defense spending. This is the reason why German troops are being permanently stationed in Lithuania. This is the background for why the calls to reintroduce a compulsory draft or conscription are becoming louder. These are maneuvers that are supposed to be visible so that we can push to drive war increasingly, and we are the domestic front here in Germany. These are connections that you can't necessarily understand immediately. More and more young people have to understand this, however, if they want to consistently fight against increasing militarization and the threat of war on our doorstep. Our experience has been that young people that we know are interested in knowing what's really going on. So here we try to offer public education where we talk about the conflicts and the problems that young people experience in their everyday lives in order to explain where it all comes from. And another point is, I think it's also important that we ensure that the people that we know, the students, the school-goers, are people that we can talk to about what's actually going on in everyday life to be able to really reach out to them. Now let's proceed to the next section, because this new level of escalation that we're seeing with Israel and Palestine has made an awareness of war much clearer among young people, and we've seen peace protests across Germany, including here in Berlin. Not just here, though, but also in companies, in schools, and at universities. We've increasingly seen that there's been more and more protests. So now what we want to talk about is how this resistance emerged. And now I would like to start with this question to Deutsch here. Now, at the last youth panel in January 23, you said, as the DIDF Youth, you talked about your campaign, 100 billion for youth. What experience did you have with your campaign last year? Just as you said, in autumn 2022, we launched our campaign, 100 billion for youth, together with the IJV, in a response to inflation and increasing defense spending and militarization. And for us, it was a concerted effort to have an accessible but also very precise slogan to try to make clear what the social problems are and the connections that they have with the arms race, and to find a response to some of the challenges that we're facing to have a broader base access to young people. And naturally, I won't be able to go through everything that we did within the framework of this campaign, but there were some helpful experiences that we gained that I'd like to talk to you about. In Marburg, for example, with our campaign, we managed to speak to a student general assembly and to initiate a common resolution. This was a response to the rent costs, the increasing student study fees, and the dilapidated buildings. One of the roofs in Marburg university actually collapsed, so that shows you how dilapidated it is. And we also called for a shift of policy within the university. And in Frankfurt, the impact of the trade union demonstration on the 1st of May was something we used, and we campaigned for 100 billion to be spent on youth needs, not on defense, and there was a fair bit of media response to this. But more important than that, within the framework of our campaign, the battle against the arms race was something, or increasing militarization was something we managed to get onto the streets. So that was very successful. At the same time, thank you. At the same time, in Berlin, we were able to use our campaign to work together with a youth club, and we were able to access various schools as well, which were important experiences that helped us in our work for sure. And finally, maybe the most moving example where we can say that we were able to communicate this to many, many young people. That was our open air festival that we held in Hamburg together with the IJV, and whether we had 3,000 or 4,000 young people collecting at a festival under this campaign motto, and there they could listen to their favorite artists from that neighborhood, and we could call for this 100 billion to be spent on education and health. And I think it was so present, so that hundreds of young people who had probably never gone to a demonstration before in their lives chanted this slogan with us. And that was a very good experience for all of us. I bet it was.
So we finished this campaign then in fall. But the topic is still relevant and important today. The task to reach out to young people who are far away from becoming part of a political discussion and debate is becoming increasingly important. So our task will be to make this conflict tangible for people. The successful steps that we have taken and made accessible is something that we need to spread for the entire movement. We need to not only spread it, but also put it onto a permanent basis. Thank you very much for your report. The next question goes to Aimo. You know quite well how the increasing militarization is reflected in classrooms, and this fear of war amongst pupils has grown tremendously during the last years. Are there approaches for peace policy alliances in schools? We're dealing here with dilapidated buildings, too large classes, and obsolete technology. And it's very bitter if in front of all that you see how much money is spent on the military. Thank you very much for the invitation. In the past, we had situations where pupils said there are 100 billions invested into an area of military, and we see that we are experiencing an obsolete, dilapidated system where the most essential things are not there. So it's a contradiction if money is being spent on the military, but where the weakest members of the society are living, working, and studying, money is being saved. So pupils called upon policymakers to find diplomatic solutions so that money can be untied to be spent in education. We're lacking 60 billion of investment missing into the buildings alone of schools, and this is not yet talking about making schools and pupils more resistant in terms of crisis. And education is a basis for being able to prevent wars and providing for a stable society. And education needs to be able to work and function well. So we must prevent a situation where education becomes an advertising campaign for the federal armed forces. We need to look for alternatives, finding alternative approaches. And international standards like human rights need to be established, need to be debated about, and this is what you need to prepare pupils for, so that they know what needs to be done in order to prevent wars from being waged in the very first place. So this is our position. Now, with a view to the future, we have to very clearly state that education is the basis for peace, for stability. We need to have the ability to engage in constructive discourses instead of only respond to situations, so that we can nip wars in the bud in the future. Thank you very much. And that brings me to a question to Freya. The SDAJ has been working on the topic of peace recently. You had a very clear position against arms build-up and in favor of peace in the context of the Ukraine war and the war in Palestine. You focused on democratic movements particularly, because these movements create a very special kind of public. Which activities and demands did you work with in this context? And this political work that you normally focus on companies and shop floors and schools, how could you bring it all together? So we worked in alliances against the Security Conference in Munich, in Easter marches, and in solidarity movements for Palestine. We use these structures and want to strengthen them. Peace with Russia and China is a slogan. The main enemy is to be found within our own country. In Germany, the main enemy is German imperialism. The large banks and corporations and the government which push for militarization and who are responsible for war across the world, being a member of NATO. A strengthening of anti-militarist awareness amongst young people is something that we can bring about if we manage to link the question of peace with other struggles. A good example for that, from my point of view, were the collective bargaining rounds for public service workers, when members of the trade union youth departments worked and connected their struggles with the question of peace. The Verdi youth movement spoke out in favor, or rather drew the attention to the price hikes being the result of the corporate greed in Germany and not something that Russia is to blame for. And we contrasted our demands for higher wages with the expenditures of 100 billion of euros for arms build-up. Let me give another example. At schools, repression against Palestine solidarity is stark. In Kassel, there was a case where a pupil was asked to talk to the head teacher. She had been wearing a Palestine cloth, and the head teacher asked her whether she's a terrorist. This and other events convinced the SDAJ that we wanted to prepare presentations on the topic of Palestine at school. We wanted to create spaces where students and pupils can exchange their views, can support each other and advance together. Wherever we live, work and learn, we need to focus on the question of peace, no matter whether we work as individual persons or within organizations, and we need to support each other mutually in our endeavors to foster peace. Another important point is that we need to bring various types of struggles together that turn against the same thing, although it doesn't meet the eye at first place. We are going to hold a students' assembly in February where we talk about freedom of expression at universities. We want to discuss what can be done against the repression of solidarity movements for Palestine, what can be done against the attacks against a self-managed cafe in Kassel. So we have to bring all these various struggles together because they have the same basis. Thank you very much. Freya has mentioned it. Things have changed at universities, have developed there. Students fought for a civilian clause. And my question to Ari is, why is a civilian clause at universities so important? And who benefits from such clause not being adhered to? And how would you assess the struggles that are going on right now? Well, it's not only people who fought for this civilian clause. This is an ongoing struggle which is going to continue. So far, we have these clauses in place in 70 universities. And they are being understood. For those who don't know what a civilian clause is at university, it is a voluntary commitment of universities not to engage in military research. And they are very often determined by what they are not meant to be. This is a limitation of arms research, military research, where arms companies make use of the minds working in universities. They want to benefit from structures at universities. So they very often are being portrayed as something negative, where the military is being kept out. But these civilian clauses or peace clauses need to be filled with a positive meaning. It's part of the ongoing conflict on already existing and still to be established civilian clauses. We're not only against military research and the presence of the military at our universities, we are in favor of an orientation of science towards peace, a positive peace, where we try to overcome the constraints of capitalism. So this is a kind of characterization of peace clauses which make a contribution to live up to their historic origin. They are the result of the fought against fascism, liberation of fascism. If you just take a look at how many universities and research institutions have contributed towards the Second World War being able to be waged in the very first place, you will understand what the origin of the peace clauses and civilian clauses is. No more war, no fascism, at the same time means no capitalism anymore. So we not only need to think of the arms corporations, but we also need to think of the scientific system and how it works. What do universities depend on? And there are a lot of economic constraints that science is subjected to. They are dependent on third-party funds. And in the context of the attacks of the Minister for Education and the attacks of other think tanks, the direction of the future will be for universities, and we know that from history, should become part of the security policy interests of this country. And that's very highly dangerous indeed, if only we take a look at the minds and means in universities. It's not only about the concrete research being done there, but it's a very similar case like with schools. If the armed forces drop in and present themselves as being a legitimate employer, the research that will be carried out will be how drone attacks can be carried out in order to be compliant with international law. This is a fight for the minds working at universities. So this is a struggle we have to wage as the SDS. We have to fight for a liberated science in order to make the use of productive forces at universities usable for progressive forces, for the fight against poverty, against inequality and conflicts across the globe. On the trade union day of the metal workers union, the IG Metall, the decision was to put an end to the war. Defeat and victory are not the categories that a trade unionist should think about when thinking about the war. These are very strong terms. What does that mean for what you do on the ground? Are there activities that can be put into the context of peace and war? Well, when the Ukraine war started, I have become more active politically. And from the very first day, there were endeavors to help civilian people in Ukraine. And 1 week after the war started, we organized relief and aid transports where aid was transported by union members, trade union members, to Ukraine. So our focus needs to be on the suffering of civilians, on members of the workers' classes who are killing each other. That's exactly what's happening there. That is the basic underlying concept of wars. We workers are being used as instruments by the capital owners in wars. Now, in our outlet, there's a lot of overlap with other associations and movements, peace fora, who are dealing with this topic in an active manner. We raise the awareness for what's happening, and when it's about a war, it's not about who wins. It's always the capitalists, the ruling classes who win, no matter on which side. And that is what we focus on in our seminars and workshops. That is the knowledge that we disseminate. Much happens on the ground on the topic of war. And we come to the conclusion that we only can suffer from war. There is nothing for us to be gained. And this brings us to the third and last part of the panel discussion. I'd like to give everybody each one on the floor the opportunity to answer the last question. We have seen that the peace demonstrations, like they have been mentioned, they were very large in Berlin, and all organizations presented today here have reported about having worked on this topic more intensively than in the past. But the protest amongst the younger generation hasn't come about, by and large. We see how the pressure to perform and the competition is something that paralyzes the studying young people. A lot of fears that workers and trainees are subject to prevents colleagues and pupils from taking part in these protest activities. And therefore, my last question to all panelists, and I'd like to suggest that we start with Aimo and then have a round of answers. How can we manage today that the peace movement becomes a movement of the young people again? Well, thank you very much for this question. I think we have various levers that can be used. We need to be aware of the fact that it's not the normal forms of protest that we had in the past, but many young people use the digital realm to look for information and to start their protest to start their campaigns in. They use them for networking, but we needed to shed more information about the various types of forms of protests that there are to express your protest. You get a lot of tools at school to make your voice heard, and I think this is one way of how we can spell out how your protest can be expressed. So it's an educational question, but a lot of structural constraints have also been fought against, as has been mentioned, so that these peace protests will be possible today and in the future as well. Thank you very much. The traditional peace movement is aging, and in spite of an ongoing series of war, it doesn't get younger. This is something that we've been wondering about for a long while. And during the Easter marches and the anti-war day, we see the large, or rather small number of young people turning out to these events. And at the same time, we're also seeing that the spontaneous protests against the war in Palestine, to the very contrary of that, are very strongly characterized by young people, particularly by young people with migration background. We cannot say that young people tend not to protest. There's only half and part of the truth. The peace movement needs to be put into the position through our contribution to responding to this awareness and to express their demands for peace in the Middle East and give it priority. You've mentioned it. The demonstration in Berlin was large, but how large could it have been if we had used our potential properly? That's a question we need to ask ourselves. At the same time, unfortunately, the peace movement missed out on condemning the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine. That does not mean that you succumb to the pressure of the media and established parties, but this is an imperialist war of aggression. That's why it has to be condemned. And also because a lot of young people feel compassion with the people in Ukraine, just like they feel compassion for the people in Palestine. We must not forget this. The main thrust of our activities needs to be directed against the imperialism of NATO states, amongst all of them, the United States, but more discussions have to be led, always with the goal to strengthen the peace movement. That's essential. And this situation is something that puts the challenge to progressive youth movements, and it's one of the largest challenges in front of us, to establish connections and links. Just like we tried to show when I talked about the campaign, there is a link between the reality that young people experience in their own life and the link to the arms buildup and spend in arms. Our training places are being reduced, our neighborhoods are being neglected, and all that only in order to support expenditures for arms. That is something that we need to bring across.
And we have to stick to our positions. We have to be aware of the fact that this is hard work, that the details matter, and that spontaneous movements can also occur, as we saw with Fridays for Future and the protests against racist police violence, right-wing terrorism, protests against the oppression of women. The involvement of young people in all of these movements show that this is fertile soil and that many young people want to become more politically active and do something against the injustice in our society. And we have to do everything we can to pave the way for them and to join forces with young people and to get their attention onto the main enemy in our country, just as Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg did in this country. Thank you.
Jan, sehr gern.
So my very, very brief response would be creating class awareness. Because that is something that is really missing among the younger generation here in this country. And I think that people often don't realize that this is a lot closer to them than they perhaps want to admit that it is, and that the differences between them and people who are dying in other areas are actually very, very little. Even if they speak a different language, have a different faith, or have a different race. I mean, I worked at an automotive suppliers company, and many people were just not interested in these issues. But that's also our problem, that we haven't managed to reach many young people. And I mean, if you look at the new voters and the numbers of new voters, then most of them vote FDP, the Liberal Party, why, or else at the far right AFD. And that's got to be our problem, that they've drifted away from us, that we didn't show them that there's another option, that they could do things differently. And essentially, you know, it's workers who are killing one another in wars, and we have to make that clear to them. And as soon as they've got greater class awareness, I think we can achieve a stronger mass movement, because before that there won't be a sense of belonging.
Danke.
Lots of young people are afraid, the precariousness of their future, a threat of climate destruction and the situation in Europe. But the other thing is that many people who are young don't have much awareness of the kinds of struggles that have been won, and so they think there's no point fighting for their own interests. And I think to crack that, it's important to counter the sense of helplessness that they have. I think this is a very important prerequisite for getting more young people in the peace movement and to battle for their own interests as well. And to achieve that, we think as the SDAJ, there are 2 points that are important. Firstly, young people need to see the options of waging battles that they can win, even if they're small ones, because that will give you a sense of success, and that will motivate them to get more involved. Some of our comrades have done that in Göttingen in the battle against having to do homework during the exam session, or in Dortmund when school buses were being cut, partially successful, or the attempts of the Deutsche Bahn, German rail, to punish a trainee unfairly. If you don't move, you don't feel your chains, is what we sometimes hear. And it's true that it gives you some practice to learn how to fight against whom. And the other thing that's important is that younger people need to have a sense of where they and how they can connect with other people, raise their awareness, get more education. We did that with school goers in Berg against Nazis in school, or a regulars table with potential trainees, and what people can do when the Bundeswehr is trying to recruit people at schools. 2024, we want to do this more, and in doing so, hopefully combat increasing militarization in Germany. And for all of this to succeed, it's important that we as youth organizations have to network more outside of this panel. I have to say that that's a bit simplified, and I think it's a false depiction of things to say that there are differences between the old generation and the young generation. And I think this sort of playing one off against the other sort of feeds into this narrative of the aged peace movement that will soon die out, hopefully. And we're never going to get anywhere if we start describing the peace movement as cool and young and hip and commenting it as the youth in a contemptuous way. It's more than that. I think we have to learn that we mustn't divide the generations, because it's always about the specific class struggles in that particular time. And I mean, the Russian invasion, for example, hasn't particularly helped the working class rise up, and the way it's been engaged with anyway. The point is not having people sink into passivity around Palestine and all of the injustice that's happening in this world, We have to combat that. That's what it's about. And this has to happen at the focus of our lives, because class awareness, sure, and I'm all in favor of education, but it's also important that the contradictions of young and old are overcome in the places that we are in. And for young people, that's normally where they're educated, be it school or university or companies. We have to perceive ourselves as a movement and not wait for the new movement, but rather see that by articulating our genuine interests as students, as trainees, as schoolgoers, that we perceive these interests and want to fight for the civil clause, for example, against violence and against being trained up for war in this society. Even if it sounds a little bit boring at university to carry out political work where you have these major property companies like Deutsche Wohnen, etc., doing their thing. No, it's not as simple as just class awareness. We have to do more than that. And so what that means for all of us is that we have to very clearly combat the war budget and say that we don't want to be cold or hungry or be dumbed down or be instrumentalized by this government to ready us for war. Thank you. We've run out of time now, so I would like to thank all of our guests here on the panel. I particularly want to thank the Junge Welt and all of the sponsors who are behind this wonderful Rosa Luxemburg conference. But of course, this weekend is not over yet with its exciting program. Tomorrow we have the LDL demonstration, so we would like to call that you march with the youth panel block, with the SDAJ, the DIDF Youth, the Left Youth, and the SDS to walk with us in the youth block at the demonstration. So have a good rest of conference and look forward to seeing you there.
Ich denke schon, ja. Sollen wir die